Hello, and welcome to MediaNama. This is Sharveer, and today I'm speaking with Hilal Ahmed Lone, the Chief Information Security Officer at Liminal Custody. Liminal is a tech company that creates secure wallet infrastructure for its clients, many of whom are in the cryptocurrency and Web3 space. The cryptocurrency industry is currently facing a crisis with numerous incidents of cyber attacks against notable exchanges, leading to the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars globally. We will be speaking to Hilal about the challenges of ensuring security for crypto firms and how the industry can deal with such serious problems. Thanks for being here, Hilal.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here.
So, in simple terms, how does liminal custody help ensure the security of its customers' platforms?
That's a there's a loaded question. So I think it's a holistic approach, right? So we consider security and trust to be basically the funding and building blocks of the business, right? So we take it extremely seriously, and the way to do it is through a holistic approach. So we have technical controls, we have operational controls, we have regulatory and compliance related controls, as well as basically having processes in place that is supported by the technology to support basically getting these things done and helping ensure that the controls are working properly. So it's a combination of both technology processes and basically having making sure that okay, it's all something that's built into the design of the business as well as the product.
Okay. Could you go a little bit into detail about what your wallet infrastructure is like? Because I understand that's one of your main products or services, right? How exactly does it function, and what exactly does it provide to your clients?
Okay, so wallet basically like in crypto world is basically where you store your digital assets, right? So you have three different types of wallets. Like one is the hot wallet, which is consumer facing. The consumers use the hot wallets and due to transactions like on the fly. And then you have warm wallets. Warm wallets are not implemented everywhere, but they are like an intermediary, like where you need access to assets or funds or any other assets, right? So you get a warm wallet as an intermediary between your cold wallet is the third type of wallet. Cold wallet is where you keep like your assets for basically storage as well as for instant custody, right? So in that aspect, the cold wallet is where you keep your majority of the sets and which are not necessarily required by the exchange or by the clients in a like moment's time, right? So it takes time. So we operate at the code wallet level. So we actually like rehydrate or repopulate like the hot and warm wallets. And in terms of basically when the funding or the transaction is initiated by the client, if the hot wallets they do not have enough funds in basically available at the moment, so they will get rehydrated from the warm and cold wallets. So that's how the wallet infrastructure actually works. Of course, there's a lot of technology and supporting infra that's actually behind all of that. But yeah, on a very high level, this is how basically wallet infrastructure actually works.
I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the cybersecurity challenges that many of the cryptocurrency exchanges, not just in India, but globally, have been facing. To set some context, in March earlier this year, hackers broke into CoinDCX, which is India's first crypto unicorn, and stole rupees 368 crores via a server breach. Earlier the same year, Bybit actually lost $1.5 billion in another cyber attack, which actually makes it the largest crypto heist in history. And the year before that, WazirX, which was then India's largest cryptocurrency exchange, lost $230 million, or around half of all of its reserves. So I just wanted to get your perspective on some of these recent incidents, because it does seem as if there has been a sort of trend towards a large number of cybersecurity incidents and cyber attacks, specifically targeting the cryptocurrency industry. So I wanted to get your perspective on this trend.
Yeah, of course. Like the recent incidents and incidents in the past, kind of like indicate that, okay, there is a serious challenge with cybersecurity and prevention and fraud and abuse on the crypto platform, right? So in that's one context of it, because we see that's very public and it makes a lot of noise, and we tend to basically see that going on, and there seems to be no end to that. But that's actually something that you see from a lens that's actually directed towards crypto system, right? So the traditional basically infrastructure and the fintechs and financial organizations suffer the similar kind of attacks, but it's a much higher volume, and the transactions and the fraud and it's not of that scale. Because here, for example, you mentioned CoinDCX, you mentioned Bybit, and all of those, like, so all of the incidents were very high profile incidents because it took very little amount of time, and the sophistication of the hack was very interesting, right? So that's why it became a lot more media basically like friendly, right? On the other hand, there are equal amounts of fraud and abuse that happens on the traditional fintech side, because I have been there. I was the CISO of Razorpay earlier, so I know exactly like how fraud and abuse works in the traditional financial industry as well. So now, why there is a lot of noise and why there's a lot of focus on cybersecurity, on crypto systems? The fact is that these kind of incidents give a lot of basically like it points to a growing trend of basically similar attacks getting executed. Because if you look at DCX, or you look at Bybit, or you look at some other hacks, right? Most of them stemmed from basically some lack of process and governance. So there has been a substantial amount of basically like people being ignorant, or they kind of like overlooking some of the process that they have to follow. For example, DCS hack basically was a social engineering. Similarly, Bybit was a social engineering. The private key was compromised after one of the systems was compromised. Similarly, other attacks had the similar kind of attack vectors. So the attacks were not necessarily very different, or the modus operandi was not very different. It's just that because we did have controls around it, but it's just that the effectiveness of those controls was not tested. So which actually brings us basically a lot more in news, because it actually the profile these are really high profile incidents that happen. But of course, like there are a lot of things that crypto industry as a whole suffers from immaturity of the tooling around it. Right. So, for example, we don't have a lot of mature tools, threat intelligence, and all those things in crypto that we do not have right now. So, I do believe that there's a lot of improvements to be made. But at the same time, like these are some of these things happened not because of lack of security, but because of negligence, and that needs to be actually like addressed.
Okay, thank you for your response. Not- I noticed that you mentioned that there was a general lack of process and governance in the cryptocurrency space, right? Uh, And do you think that the traditional banking and finance industry, which, as you said, is also subject to its own fraud and abuse, is something that has managed to evolve a much higher standard of processes and cybersecurity governance than the cryptocurrency industry? And if so, how exactly can the cryptocurrency industry catch up to the traditional banking and finance space?
So you're right. So on one hand, the regulated entities like the banks and other financial instruments like insurance and all that, right? So they have very mature regulatory and compliance frameworks. So you know exactly the environment in which you are supposed to operate. And if, for example, if basically like there is negligence or there is lack of due diligence from any of the operators, so their business actually becomes basically sort of like vulnerable to being actually like they can stop the licensing, they can stop them from operating from a particular geography, or they can put suspension on the services and things like that. So there is enforcement in the traditional financial industry, right? So the crypto basically like standards do not actually have basically any centralized regulations, or it does not basically have any traditional basically like frameworks that actually support it. So a lot of it stems from the fact that there's lack of enforcement in terms of basically the regulatory and compliance front. There's no global or regional standards that actually like the crypto industries can actually adopt. So while we are actually working on it, it's still some way, because I don't think, and if we can point out one regulatory standard that the crypto has to follow, you will be very difficult to basically like I will be surprised that if you know exactly like these are the standards that you should follow. So, which means that like there is a lack of awareness, there's lack of basically like a lot of these things that we need to have in place to be able to match the standards that are there in the traditional basically like financial instruments. Now, the challenge is that the crypto industry or the crypto systems were built with decentralization, autonomy, or it used to be autonomous, and anonymization and things like that. So, which are principles it should be based on. So a lot of these regulations and all of this will be actually contrasting with the principles for crypto industry. So it's kind of like saying that, okay, what I started with, I'm not going to basically continue with that. So there's a general, basically the sentiment in the industry adopters as well as the founders that, okay, there are some regulations that may be applicable and some may not be applicable, particularly stopping fraud and abuse. For that, we have like basically like AML checks, which is money laundering checks. We want to make sure that people do not abuse the platform. So we have other things in place, which does actually take care of most of these things. But we have a long way to go to basically like get standards or get regulations in place to match what the traditional security is there in the financial system that follow the traditional methods.
Okay. So I noticed that you mentioned that the cryptocurrency industry is something that is built around decentralization, right? As opposed to a central bank, there is no central bank for Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency like that. Do you think that particular sort of, shall I say, the foundational philosophy of cryptocurrency is something that could end up actively harming cryptocurrency users today because it might prevent cryptocurrency firms from coming together and forming, say, even if it's a self-regulatory body or coming up with some kind of industry standards that everybody has to follow, even if it's not a top-down policy that is set out by the government?
See, there is no question about basically like ensuring that there is some way to kind of like regulate the money flow or regulate the contracts, right? So otherwise, there will be a lot of basically like influx of fraud and abuse on the system, right? So we want to make sure that that does not happen. So given that kind of situation where we want to make sure that, okay, the platforms that we build or we operate are not abused, we need certain controls in place, right? But at the same time, we also do not want to compromise on the principles on which it was built, because then it loses its basically like the functionality that it was supposed to offer. So there has to be a compromise between functionality and controls, right? So, or functionality and the regulations. So while we cannot go full throttle or we cannot go all in on basically the regulation, but at the same time, we want some way to make sure that, okay, we are basically like not being used for any kind of basically abuse, right? So in terms of basically, will it harm this crypto industry? I don't think so, because that's if that had to happen, that it's not. I mean, the industry itself is a bit basically in the far more mature state than it was before, and the decentralization is there for a reason, right? So we don't want basically like somebody to kind of like make sure that they make decisions on based on somebody else, right? So everybody needs to have that say in basically like how the chain operates, how the contracts actually flow. So I don't think that's actually a desirable outcome of this, but I do believe that there has to be some compromise made which actually balances the control with basically the features that actually make up the blockchain or cryptocurrencies. For example, the decentralization, anonymity, autonomous, basically, and all of the basically native features that blockchain offers. I don't think that should be compromised.
Okay. Just to wrap up, sorry. Now, if I could ask you to point out, according to you, if there's a single biggest security change that you think Indian exchanges must make so that similar things such as the WazirX hacks or the CoinDCX hacks don't happen again. If there's a single change that they can make, according to you, what would it be?
Yeah, so unfortunately, there is no single thing that can prevent all of these things because, like I said in the beginning, also it needs to be holistic. By holistic, I mean it has to be a combination of different things. You need to put in process in place where you ensure that a single person getting compromised does not lead to a wider impact. You need those kind of processes in place. You need to make sure that you have segregation of duties. One person should not be the approver as well as the reviewer of the transactions. Similarly, like for example, we have technology in place, like for example, Liminal offers basically like multi-signature wallets, which requires like at least 3 to 4 signatures for it to be executed. Or basically, we have MPC, which is like multi-party computing, which means that the key is divided into multiple parties, so that a single person cannot become like the victim of that, right? So in that context, like people have to adopt those strategies and ensure that okay, like a single compromise should not lead to a massive hack. And like I think if one thing they can do is they need to basically like double down on key protection, making sure that the keys are not compromised. And to be able to do that, they obviously need to change basically the culture as well as the technology that they operate on. So in summary, like I think it's a combination of things, but most important, how they protect their private keys and how they ensure that the roles actually are basically selected based on basically principles like segregation of duties and two-man control and multi-signature. I think that will help the actions a lot.
So I wanted to bring in a global context now. So in January this year, there was a joint statement issued from the governments of the United States, South Korea, and Japan, which claimed North Koreans state-backed actors for carrying out cyber attacks on cryptocurrency exchanges across the world and stealing around $659 million in 2024. This included the infamous WazirX hack. So, how do you see the rise of state-backed threat actors targeting the crypto sector, and what are some of the additional challenges that come with dealing with such parties?
So in security terms, in cybersecurity, we call them persistent threats or targeted attacks. So meaning that like somebody from North Korea, like a Lazarus group, which are responsible for more of the most of the crypto hacks, like they operate in a certain way, and while they are adaptable and they actually change their modus operandi from time to time, but it's always important to basically understand that we have to make sure that there's a strategy to counter any kind of advanced persistent threats or any kind of targeted attack. So we have to be able to basically do like consistent visibility and consistent monitoring on our infrastructure that actually supports wallets or supports basically blockchains. So the idea is that like some of these persistent threats are not very noisy. They don't actually work like day in, day out. So they will carry out one activity today and like 3 months later, they'll conduct one more activity. So there are a lot of different ways they operate, right? So meaning that like it's very difficult to basically create a pattern or create a monitoring dashboard for them to basically for us to be able to basically track them effectively. So we need to basically rely on a lot in terms of basically like say causal analysis. We'll rely a lot on basically like a deep threat intel and basically like indicators of compromise as well as signals coming from different sources. So to be able to track these groups like Lazarus and all that, so we have to be constantly analyzing that data. And once we analyze the data, we come to know whether we are being victims of a persistent threat or not. So in order for us to be like a step ahead of them, right, so we want to make sure that we have taken care of the basics from our side, as well as ensure that, okay, like whatever modus operandi they're going to be using, we are not going to be fall victims for that. And so this requires basically like visibility into basically like the signals that they're actually creating, as well as basically ensuring that, okay, we have real-time monitoring and alerting in place to make sure that, okay, any persistent attacks not successful. Discovering the attacks is not very easy. Like I said, they don't create a lot of noise. So which means that like we have to have really good infrastructure to basically detect that, meaning that like we had to have analysis of data over months and months or years and years to figure out whether we are going to be the next targets or not. So I think this is something that our organization already adopted, but still there's a long way to go. I don't think we have perfected it, but yeah, some basic controls are still being developed and some are being already implemented as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned you might be able to predict it, whether you may or your organization may be the next target or not. But I wanted to know, let's assume that, for example, you are able to determine that you may be a potential target for an advanced persistent threat in the near future. What exactly do you do then?
Yeah, one small correction. So we don't just say that we might be potential targets. We think we are always going to be targets, meaning that we are in a state of always making sure that, okay, we are ready for any kind of exigency that may actually arise because of persistent threats. So because we believe that, okay, we are in a something called basically a breach ready state, meaning that we believe that like we are not going to basically like, be able to counter everything that they have. So we have to be ready all the time. right? So in order for us to do that, we want to make sure that, okay, like there is nothing of interest for them. So like I always give this analogy, right? So if to put out a fire, you either remove the oxygen or basically, or you remove the fuel, right? So only those two things can stop a fire. Similarly, when we want to basically make sure that we are ready for persistent threats, we remove basically the objects of their interest, or what they can actually gain from our compromising our systems. So we don't want to basically have somebody actually have access to sensitive information that they will want, right? So we want, for example, I was talking about basically earlier about uh, securing your private keys or making protection of private keys a priority. So in order for us to do that, we want to make sure that nobody actually has a key ever in plain text. Everybody is like a zero knowledge system. Nobody has the knowledge about where the key is. So if, for example, the persistent attack tomorrow is even successful, they have got nothing to gain from it because they cannot exploit our systems. So meaning that when we remove basically things that they want, there's no point in for them to basically attack us over and over again because it's a exercise in futility for them. They don't gain anything from it. So that's how basically we prepare ourselves to ensure that, okay, like we want to make sure that, okay, they want to basically be in execute transactions. We don't allow transactions to happen basically from a key or from a single state actor. So we want to make sure that we have basically like proper authentication authorization in place, which includes basically hardware based authentication or a physical authentication. So meaning that when we have those basically like controls in place, no matter what happens, we are not going to be victims in that. So when we actually like mature our system to that level, we mature our process to that level, then it becomes rather basically straightforward, basically counter any kind of attack that can come from institutional, basically like basically these attack groups like Lazarus and all that come from North Korea and states like that.
Okay. Now, just to add one last question about some of the state-backed actors, do you think that is there a particular reason that they're specifically targeting the cryptocurrency sector more? Because I think it's comparatively rare to find examples of advanced persistent threats targeting banking or finance, for example. So,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, see, I can give a lot of examples. Like, so for example, SolarWinds attack was there that compromised like 75% of the servers worldwide, right? So CrowdStrike actually happened that compromised like 80% of the servers worldwide. So persistent threats can get actually like prominence anywhere, right? Yeah, but you're right. So the crypto industry is actually a juicy target, primarily because there is this complexity involved in the systems that is kind of like give rise to vulnerabilities and things like that. So I think because of the lack of knowledge and lack of monitoring over the cross-chain networks and things like that, because there's no interoperability in terms of monitoring and things like that. So I do believe that it actually can be a juicy target for them, right? But at the same time, it's very important to understand that it's not just the persistent threats, right? So it's like the regular threats also becoming like a big nuisance, like one of attack come not just coming from Lazarus and all that, but coming from very isolated incidents. They become nuisance as well, and there can be potential for insider threats as well, right? So insider threat can execute a like a fraudulent transaction that could be in millions, and you will not be able to detect that. So it's a holistic thing. I think it's a all around thing for us to basically ensure that, okay, all of these things are basically counted for. And to basically, I think in terms of the ratio we see persistent threats getting executed against crypto versus the traditional cyber systems, I think it can be 80 to 20%. So I think 80% of their attacks will be targeted at manufacturing. It will be logistics. It will be healthcare. It will be IT, and then the 20% of it is basically like directed towards crypto systems. It's just a matter of basically visualizing it and looking at it in a perspective that actually puts in like it in a very very clear basically like plots in a very clear way, rather than actually having clubbing it as saying that, okay, just because it's noisy it becomes more attractive to them.
okay, I understand that. But also, I think most of these cryptocurrency attacks, they're also more about the stealing of money rather than, say, infrastructural damage or causing some kind of uh, a disruption somewhere. I think. So, do you think that is something that also plays a role?
Oh, absolutely. Motivation for basically financial gain is always going to be there, and this is something that's more or less going to be untraceable, right? So that's a very big motivation factor for any kind of hacker, right? So they want money and they can disappear with it. So yeah, I think that plays a big role, and you're absolutely right in that.
Okay. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the traceability of stolen cryptocurrency funds. Say, for example, uh, an exchange that you're working with is hacked today. Uh, for example, would it be possible for the users whose cryptocurrencies have been stolen to be recovered? And what are the realistic expectations that they should have?
Yes, it can be yes and no. Yes, if that money trail is actually, or the transaction trail is traced to basically the conversion place, where it gets actually something, say for example, DCX or wallet transaction actually flows down to Binance, can be traced. But if it goes to basically cross-link, something that's not basically traceable, so cannot be traced, right? So, and usually, like, it's the second thing that usually happens in hacks because they don't go to the like your traditional exchange, they go to non-traditional exchange. So, meaning that like it's a very sensitive thing to talk about, particularly when people would want to know if that money is safe or not. So you cannot just say that, oh yeah, it is 100% safe or 100% not safe. That's not an answer they are looking for. They're looking for like a binary answer, yes or no. And this is not, there is no binary answer.
I understand, of course, there cannot be a binary answer for something like this, but if you could illustrate some of the challenges that somebody who's trying to trace some of these cryptocurrencies that have been stolen could face, and if there's any potential way that we can overcome those. Now, my next question is, if an exchange you work with is hacked today, what are some of the steps you need to take immediately?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two things that we do both on the prevention side as well as the detection side, right? So we want to make sure that, okay, on the preventive side, we want to see like whatever wallets were being compromised on that exchange, we want to add that to our blacklists so that they are not actually like compromised again. And we have the facility to ensure that, okay, all those wallets are basically added automatically in our block lists, and we blacklist all the basically transactions that are going on with them. That's the first thing. And we isolate basically the exchange because we work with more than one exchange, so we isolate that exchange, preserve basically our transactions with them, whatever has happened, so that if, for example, we need to do an investigation, we have enough collateral to basically do our investigation properly. And then, of course, like we want to notify the basically affected. If it was basically our responsibility to inform, then we'll inform the affected parties basically of the hack, which can be public as well as private. And if there is any notification that needs to be sent to any of the bodies that we actually come, for example, in some geographies, we may be working with some regulatory bodies, and they may want us to basically inform them as well. So we'll inform them as well about it. Then the standard instant response basically playbook actually gets started. Like for example, the insurance actually happens. We want to make sure that we have started basically like analyzing the origin and basically make sure that the exchange also gets help from us in terms of basically doing their investigation as well, right? So on the detection side of things, so we want to make sure that, okay, we create the forensic images of the system that are working with that exchange. We preserve basically the state in which they are actually operating at that time, so that if the law enforcement needs it in the future, we can actually like facilitate that. Apart from that, if there is any kind of involvement for basically insurance, because they will exchange will definitely want some insurance and things like that, right? So we want to basically facilitate that as well, and if it is within our capacity to do so. Apart from that, we will also want to make sure that the exchange is able to kind of like is able to carry out their own investigations as well. Right, so we want to basically trace that as well. If there is the different types of logs that we can actually share, like the trace logs, the transaction logs, and things like that. And if they are subscribed to our whitelist and blacklist, we want to update that as well. So there are a lot of different things that we do when exchange gets basically hacked. The most important of them is basically to isolate it and blacklist so that it does not continue to be exploited. So that's the thing that we do in case an exchange gets actually compromised. The second, I think, point is that basically like we want to understand, okay, what was the nature of the hack, and put in policies in place and basically like lessons learned from that. and ensure that actually we bake that into the incident response to ensure that we are not victims of the similar kind of attack as well. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for this. Now, that brings me to my last question. So, recently, the Financial Intelligence Unit made cybersecurity audits compulsory for all virtual digital asset service providers operating in India. So, what is your perspective on this move? And what are some other policies needed to help crypto firms secure their customers' funds?
Yeah, I think this is a great initiative. Like the FIU basically sending notices that okay, regular audits are necessary, and we have been at Liminal. We have been doing it since our inception. So I think it's a welcome thing for us because we have been already doing it. So it becomes a natural thing for us to comply with that as well. And it's very fortunately that we have all the things ready for to comply with this order. So yeah, I think a very welcome change. I think it should be more frequent, and there should be some way of like surprise audits as well. I think that will help because to make sure that people are maintaining due diligence and they're maintaining the baseline controls. So that will also allow people to basically like map the requirements with the controls that are necessary. In terms of policies, I think we already have a lot of basically the KYB and KYC and all those things in place, right? I think that can be further strengthened to ensure that okay the legitimate transactions actually go through, and the auditability is very very important. So the auditability from basically the baseline transactions is very important. I think in other ways, what they can actually facilitate is basically the um, liaison between law enforcement agencies as well as the exchange. I think that will definitely help if they bring in a simplified policy of how do we actually deal with it. And if there's a centralized, basically like a database or a repository where people can share basically different incidents that they have faced, that actually will be very, very helpful.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for this enlightening discussion, Hilal. It was a great pleasure speaking with you. For more tech policy updates, please subscribe to MediaNama.